How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another week of the Pioneer tier list. We had a lot going on this weekend, including 2 Pioneer challenges, a Pioneer Super PTQ, which I played in, and you can find all 9 rounds on my YouTube channel, along with a handful of prelims, giving us one of the biggest weeks of data we've had in a hot minute. Before we jump right into that, let's get some housekeeping done. First thing, if you're not already subscribed to the YouTube channel, please be sure to hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out, and only about 30% of you who watch these videos are actually subscribed. Next up, be sure to check out my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/darthjacen. Starting on the 11th, so next Monday, I'll be streaming 5 days a week over there during reasonable US EST hours, so be sure to check that out. I'll post the full schedule on my Twitter this week, so keep an eye out for that, especially if you enjoy live Pioneer gameplay. So let's jump right in to our tier list for this week. Starting in the F&M tier, we have a lot of decks, so we're not going to go too deep into them since there were 82 results we're counting for this week. Sometimes you're going to see some archetypes that were either flash of the pan, don't really line up, or we need a lot more from them before we can really move them up. But these are decks that you can take to your local events, your local F&M, and have a good time with, and maybe with some refinements, they could climb the list themselves. First up, we have Ruda, a deck that several streamers, including Connor Man and Otterhouse, have been playing to some success. Monogram Stompy, which managed to take second in the challenge on Saturday. Definitely an interesting deck, something a little bit of a throwback to the original Monogram Aggro decks that were in the format that have now become Karn based. Next up, we have Abzan Greasefang, the only of the Greasefang decks to really put up any results this weekend. Blue-White Spirits, another iteration of the various Spirits decks, along with Bant Spirits, both showed up once or twice, but not really putting up the same level of results as Mono Blue Spirits. Next up, we have Gruel Combo. This leverages Combat Celebrant along with copy effects like Fable of the Mirror Breaker to one-turn kill your opponent, especially if they tap out or don't understand how the combo works. Next up, we have Ensoul, a throwback to one of the original decks from a couple seasons ago, but still not doing great into a metagame of Rakdos Mid-Range. Next up, Mono White Humans, though I think the 3 and 4 color humans decks are better than they look. I think Mono White is a bit of a stretch, though it is an interesting concept, and I'm curious to see how it turns out. Next up is Grixis Phoenix. We saw this once during the weekend. Interesting to add that 3rd color into Phoenix, as was speculated with the printing of the Triomes, but I can't really see it being the de facto way Phoenix moves, especially right now. Next up, we have Gruel Aggro, obviously spoiled in the Challenger decks from Wizards of the Coast that'll be coming later. Shows up every once in a while, nothing to write home about, along with White-Black Humans and Dimir Control, both of which showed up a little bit. But again, Challenger decks that I would say are interesting. Glad to see they showed up. Hopefully that's a sign that the Challenger decks will be worthwhile in the future. But for now, these live firmly in F&M tier, along with our last deck, Blue-Red Control. Control is in a awkward position right now, and I think Blue-Red, with the loss of Expressive Iteration, is surely lower than Blue-White and even Blue-Black, but I think Control in general right now is in a little bit of a lull thanks to the decks at the top of the metagame. Next up, we have the D tier. These are your decks that are solid decks, often will be better positioned in larger scale events than the F&M tier decks, but generally speaking, they're not favorites to be able to put up much of a result in the context of the overall weekend or higher level events. First up, we have Nivtalite, continuing to be a solid mid-range option to try and go over the top of some of the other mid-range decks, but as we see with Monogram Karn and Is It Phoenix, it feels like there's a lot of decks that are able to interact on key turns or go even further over the top of you. And with the rise of decks like Heroic and Mono Blue Spirits, there's tempo decks that can get under you and protect from your various removal spells. Next up, we have Jund Sacrifice, another classic deck that certainly has a high ceiling as far as how good the deck can do. I don't think it's likely to do a lot of winning right now. Next up, we have Blue-Red Prowess, which Todd Anderson built on his stream. I like the addition of One Mind paired with Ledger Shredder and Young Pyromancer. Deck seems really well positioned as a low to the ground deck, similar to the blue-red prowess decks of Modern before Modern Horizons 2. But I think along with another D tier deck, we're seeing these style of aggro decks falter, especially when you put them up against Izzet Phoenix and Rakdos Mid-Range. Finally, we have Monored as the last D tier deck, similar to Blue-Red Prowess, but with less staying power in the mid to late game. You're able to get under certain decks, especially attacking the Mono Blue Spirits decks, but we've seen a shift from that being the primary attack to the top of the meta, and as such, Monored is falling lower and lower due to its matchups against the various Rakdos decks, Izzet decks, and the fact that Monogram Karn is able to more reasonably stabilize against it now than it was previously. Next up, we're going to jump right to that S tier, the top echelon of the metagame, because everything below it is going to be put into the context of these S tier decks. First up, we have a return to a classic S tier deck, something that had sat at the top for a very long time, that is Izzet Phoenix. This deck lost Expressive Iteration. It took a hot minute for people to figure out how best to build it, but after it won the NRG 5K, beating Monogram Karn in the finals, we've seen a lot of top Magic Online players take this to great results this weekend, including a second and third place finish in the Super PTQ. I think Blue-Red Phoenix is one of the best decks in the metagame right now. It rewards type play, you have explosive starts, you have a lot of flexibility, and then you get the access to powerful sideboard cards like Aether Gust and Disdainful Stroke to be able to apply early pressure and then sit back, counter key spells, and take the game over quickly enough that you don't fall into the same trap that blue-white control does. I think Izzet Phoenix is one of the best decks right now, and it's probably my go-to pick for events this weekend. Next up, we have Rakdos Mid-Range, which managed to win both of the challenges this weekend. It's a deck that continues to punish the rise of aggro decks that show up trying to attack things like Monogram Karn, and the work that Misplaced Ginger and others have put into the deck list have made it more on an even footing against Karn. I still think Monogram Karn is favored in that matchup, certainly, but played well and boarded well. I think it's a lot closer than it was a few weeks ago. I think Rakdos gets a lot of percentage points by just being able to attack on a lot of different axes, and decks have a hard time dealing with the early creatures, the mid to late game planeswalkers, and the plethora of discard and removal. I think Rakdos Midrange is in a great position to fight with Izzet Phoenix, but I prefer the Phoenix matchup into it, especially with Treasure Cruise and the other delve spells like Temporal Trespass, giving you really good late game insurance while you can remove things like your Ledger Shredder if you're worried about one-for-oneing early in the game. Next up, we move down to A tier. These are decks that generally are great in the metagame, can be seen winning or putting up top results. And you shouldn't be surprised if these are decks you face in a bigger tournament, especially at your local events. People might not change in and out of decks, but these are still great options to be using. Oftentimes they have a bad matchup or two in decks in the S tier, or they specifically sit in a place in the metagame where they might beat S tier decks and lose to a lot of other decks. This week we start with Boros Heroic, putting up a strong set of finishes, including winning the Super PTQ along with second place in the Sunday challenge. This deck is great into a lot of the mid-range and non-interactive decks, things like Lotus Field, Monogram Karn. However, you really do struggle into Izzet Phoenix and Rakdos Midrange, so you're able to heavily punish some of the more played decks in the format, especially Mono Green, but you do struggle into the S tier decks, and that is a big thing holding the deck back from being able to reach that S tier, but it is still putting up consistent and good results from the last couple weeks. Definitely a deck to keep your eye on. Next up, we have Monogram Karn, putting up another so-so weekend, putting up 5 top finishes between the challenges and the Super PTQ, but again, struggling to really put up much of a top 8 showing. In this case, putting up 0 top 8s once again. We're seeing this deck start to struggle against people targeting it. Blue-Red Phoenix is able to craft a good board plan. Rakdos Midrange is able to get a better percentage along with Rakdos Sacrifice by changing their deck list, and Heroic is able to punish it along with Mono Blue Spirits. I think Monogram Karn is still a very strong deck that will punish the underprepared or those who aren't playing the right deck lists of these matchups, but you have more predators in the metagame than you did before. I think that's certainly worth noting. Next up, we have Rakdos Sacrifice, which previously was suffering due to the prevalence of Monogram Karn, but with the change in style of the deck, moving more towards Claim the Firstborn, losing Onicult Anvil, and running Ob Nixilis instead, you're able to get around some of the problems that Karn the Great Creator gave. I think this is a great option at being able to punish opposing decks that want to stabilize the board with creatures, and you still have the same great mid to late game engines, just minus Onicult Anvil, and instead leveraging more traditional play to the board cards and things like Witness that can draw you extra cards and help filter you into your answers in the mid to late game. Next up, we have the B tier. These decks are still solid. Generally, will have some skew of matchups in the top echelon that are good. It's not surprising to see them put up top 8s, often having good weekends, including for both of these decks, putting up several top 8 finishes in the weekend. But when you look at their metagame percentage against all the things above them, generally it tends to look a little dicey. They might be beating up part of the upper echelon, but having tough matchups against the rest. First up, we have Mono Blue Spirits, which put up a good showing on Sunday with a 3rd, 4th finish, along with a top 8 finish in Saturday's challenge. I think people are prepared for Mono Blue Spirits, and the rise of Rakdos Mid-Range and Is It Phoenix makes it tough. Rakdos Sacrifice also giving you troubles, but you should be able to fight Monogram Karn, Lotus Field, and various control decks rather well, but you are starting to find yourself against a lot of 1-mana removal spells, and that's never where Spirit decks want to be. Next up, we have Lotus Field. This is the combo deck of the format, and it does fairly well into Is It Phoenix. Things like Rakdos Mid-Range can give you some trouble. Rakdos Sacrifice generally is a little better since they're not able to close as quickly. Monogram Karn, though, and Heroic, definitely difficult along with Mono Blue Spirits. I'm not surprised to see Lotus Field starting to see a tick up as we see the aggro decks get pushed out. Generally against control and mid-range, Lotus Field can thrive. However, these decks are able to reasonably combat Lotus Field, and you still have some monstrously bad matchups like against Monogram Karn and Heroic. I do like the addition of Pithing Needle into the board to hit Karn the Great Creator, making your Monogram matchup much more palatable. But overall, I think Lotus Field is still a step or two behind the metagame. And though it did put up a 3rd, 4th, and 5th through 8th finish on Sunday, the rest of the weekend was a little tough for it. Last up, we have the C tier, and this is where you're going to find some of your decks that sort of separate between the lower tiers and the upper tiers, your gatekeepers of what I would expect to be putting up good finishes, often with polarizing matchups or with the ability to win games out of nowhere, but with having difficulty with their game plan in post-board scenarios. First up, we have Blue-White Control. Again, a deck that punishes decks like Is It Phoenix and Rakdos Mid-Range, but with the updated builds of Rakdos Mid-Range, you're able to survive into the late game much more consistently. You do struggle against Monogram Karn, Mono Blue Spirits, Lotus Field, and Heroic. And again, you just start to see a large number of close or tough matchups, and that's a tough place to be when you're expected to win 7 or 8 rounds in a tournament. Next up, we have Blue-Red Creativity. This is a deck that Aspiring Spike put some time into and put up several 5-0s with. I think this deck is interesting to see the Torrential Gear Hulk angle of leveraging impressive spells like Magma Opus, but I think the deck overall has some weaknesses in post-board games, and while it had a surprisingly good showing this weekend as far as the few times we did see it, including a 3rd, 4th place finish on Saturday, I think this is a deck that we might need a little bit more time and refinement in to be able to really push some of the other decks out, along with being a deck that relies on your graveyard as well as high mana value spells. Makes it a little tricky to sit in the current metagame where decks can get under you or apply early threats and then sit with counter spells, making it difficult for you to close out the game. So that's the tier list for this week. Thank you everyone who watches this week and any other. Like I said before, I'll be going full time with 5 streams a week starting on July 11th. So keep an eye out on my Patreon, my YouTube channel, and my Twitch channel for more updates and more content. Thanks everyone for watching. See you next time.